home, he saw her photography in the newsletter and was stunned with horror. What happened next changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The city stretched out before him in a mosaic of light and shadow, the towering skyscrapers of the financial district reflecting the last remnants of the setting sun. Below, the streets pulsed with life. Cars idled at stoplights, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and the distant hum of conversation mixed with the occasional honk of a taxi. Dr. James Carter adjusted the strap of his bag as he stepped out of the hospital's glass doors. His shift had finally ended, marking another grueling 14-hour day in the elite private clinic where he worked as a surgeon. The weight of exhaustion settled into his muscles, but he welcomed the cool night air as it brushed against his skin. The city, at this hour, was his sanctuary, a place where he could clear his mind and reflect on the countless cases he had handled throughout the day. He had come a long way from the small, overcrowded apartment where he had spent his childhood. Raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where dreams rarely extended beyond survival, he had fought for every inch of his success. His talent and relentless work ethic had earned him a scholarship to one of the best medical schools in the country. Now, he was one of the youngest surgeons at the clinic, though he often felt the weight of being the only black doctor in an establishment dominated by old money and legacy hires. James never let it show, but he knew that he had to be twice as good, twice as careful, and make half as many mistakes as his colleagues if he wanted to keep his position. He had spent years perfecting the art of remaining unshakable in the face of scrutiny. Even so, he sensed the unspoken hesitance in the eyes of some of his peers and patients. Respect was there, but trust had to be constantly reaffirmed. The thought lingered in his mind as he walked through the quieter part of the city. He preferred taking the long way home, avoiding the congested subway in favor of a quiet, meditative stroll through the dimly lit streets. It was in these moments that he could simply be, without the pressure of perfection, without the sharp gazes of those waiting for him to falter. As he passed an alleyway between two apartment buildings, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than shifting shadows, but then he heard it, a muffled sniffle, followed by the soft, uneven rhythm of someone crying. He slowed his pace, turning his head toward the sound. Near the edge of the sidewalk, under the weak glow of a flickering streetlight, sat a small figure. It took him a moment to fully register what he was seeing. A young girl, no older than 7 or 8, curled into herself with her head bowed down. She wore a light-colored dress and a jacket that looked too thin for the night's chill. Her hair was tangled, her shoes scuffed, and her small hands clutched one arm protectively against her chest. James felt a pull in his chest, a deep, instinctual need to step forward. "Hey there," he said softly, lowering his voice to something soothing. The girl flinched at his approach, her tear-streaked face jerking upward. Her eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty and fear. James immediately understood the unspoken tension in her expression. He was a stranger, a man towering over her in the dark, his features unfamiliar. And he was black. Something that he knew from experience sometimes made encounters like these more complicated than they needed to be. He took a step back, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice calm. "I just want to make sure you're okay." The girl didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Finally, her lips parted, and her voice came out in a shaky whisper. "My hand." James's gaze dropped to where she held her arm against her body. Even in the poor lighting, he could see the unnatural angle of her wrist, the swelling around the joint. His medical training kicked in instantly. "Can I take a closer look?" he asked gently. She hesitated but nodded, her fear momentarily overshadowed by pain. He crouched down to her level, moving slowly so as not to startle her. His fingers carefully examined the injury, his touch as light as possible. Even so, she winced when he applied slight pressure. A fractured radius, possibly severe. If it wasn't treated soon, the bones might set incorrectly, causing permanent damage. The swelling was already increasing. There was no time to waste. James exhaled through his nose, calculating his next move. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The girl shook her head. I don't know." His stomach tightened. A lost child with a serious injury. He had to act, but how? Calling an ambulance would take too long. He could take her to the nearest ER, but the wait times were notoriously high, and there was no guarantee they'd prioritize a child with a non-life-threatening injury. The fastest, safest way was to take her directly to his clinic. He had access to the best equipment there. He could set the fracture properly and ensure she didn't suffer long-term consequences. But there was a problem. A black man driving through the city at night with a white child in his car. No witnesses to confirm he had only just found her. If someone called the police, if an officer pulled him over, he didn't want to think about what assumptions would be made. He weighed the risks against the reality of the girl's condition. Then he made his choice. "Okay," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm going to help you, but we need to go somewhere safe first." The girl looked at him, her expression a mixture of pain and wariness. "Do you trust me?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she nodded. James lifted her carefully, supporting her injured arm as he carried her toward his car. His mind raced with potential complications, with worst-case scenarios that could unfold if someone misunderstood the situation. But above all else, one thought remained clear. He couldn't leave her like this. Whatever happened next, he would deal with it. Because in this moment, his duty as a doctor came first. James drove through the dimly lit streets with a calculated calm, his grip on the steering wheel firm but controlled. The child, her name now known to him, Emily, sat beside him, her small frame wrapped in the blanket he had pulled from the back seat. She was silent, staring down at her lap, her good hand gripping the fabric tightly. Every now and then, she winced, the pain in her fractured wrist surfacing through the numbing haze of adrenaline. James kept his focus on the road, but his mind raced with everything that could go wrong. A black man driving through the city with an injured white child. If anyone stopped him, if she panicked and said something unclear, if someone misinterpreted the situation, the consequences could be severe. He didn't want to think about it, but he had to. He had spent his entire life being careful, being hyper-aware of how others perceived him, knowing that the margin for error was much smaller for him than for others. Yet, he had made a choice, and now he had to follow through. The clinic was a short drive away, a pristine, high-end medical facility designed for private clients willing to pay exorbitant amounts for exclusive care. It was past standard operating hours, but as a staff surgeon, he had access to the surgical suites and equipment. He pulled into the underground parking lot, glancing at Emily to make sure she was still awake. She looked exhausted, her eyelids heavy, but she was watching him with quiet trust. "I'm going to carry you inside," he said gently. "We'll get your hand fixed up, okay?" She nodded without hesitation. It was a strange thing, how quickly children could shift from fear to acceptance when given even the smallest comfort. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms, mindful of her injury, and carried her through the staff entrance. Inside, the clinic was eerily quiet, the usual daytime buzz of doctors and patients replaced by dimmed hallways and the soft hum of overnight machinery. The reception area was empty except for the night shift administrator, a middle-aged woman named Sharon, who looked up from her desk as James entered. Her eyes flickered between him and the child in his arms, narrowing slightly. "Dr. Carter?" Her voice held a note of confusion, and James braced himself for what was coming. "I need to get her into surgery," he said evenly. "She has a severe radius fracture and the swelling is increasing. I don't have time to wait for an ER." Sharon hesitated. "Where are her parents?" "She's lost. I found her injured. I'll contact the authorities once she's stable." The answer didn't seem to satisfy her, but she nodded reluctantly. "I'll notify the surgical nurse on call." James exhaled slowly, grateful for the lack of outright resistance. He knew how this looked, how it could look, but right now he needed to focus on the task at hand. He carried Emily into the prep room, setting her gently on the gurney as the surgical team gathered. It was a small group, just the on-call nurse, a lab technician, and himself. They worked quickly, taking vitals, administering a low dose of sedation to keep her comfortable, and preparing for the procedure. James studied the X-ray as it appeared on the monitor. The fracture was clean, but badly displaced. He would have to realign the bones and secure them with a small plate to ensure proper healing. It wasn't the most complex operation he had ever performed, but the margin for error was small, especially in a growing child. As he scrubbed in, he allowed himself a brief moment of detachment. In the operating room, there were no politics, no external biases, no dangers beyond the scalpel and the human body. Here, he was in control. Here, he knew exactly what to do. The surgery began. Time seemed to slow as he worked, each movement precise, every step calculated. He set the bone in place, secured the plate, and ensured minimal disruption to the surrounding tissue. His hands, steady from years of training, moved with confidence. For that hour, the weight of the outside world disappeared. There was only the patient, the procedure, and the pulse of the monitors keeping time with his own heartbeat. When he finally made the last suture and stepped back, he let out a quiet breath of relief. It had gone perfectly. Emily would recover. The nurse cleaned up as James removed his gloves, glancing at the clock. It was well past midnight. He walked to the recovery room where Emily lay, her small hand now secured in a protective brace. She was still under mild sedation, her breathing soft and steady. For the first time since he had found her, she looked peaceful. But James knew his work wasn't done. He had to find her parents. He stepped into the hallway, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The exhaustion was catching up to him, but he forced himself to push it aside. He needed to think clearly. The best course of action would be to contact the police now that she was stable. But something inside him hesitated. He had spent enough time in emergency medicine to know how these situations sometimes played out. A black man bringing in a white child with no verifiable explanation. It wouldn't matter that he was a doctor, that he had saved her hand. It was too easy for people to assume the worst. And then there was the girl herself. Emily had clung to him, trusted him, relied on him. If she woke up in a sterile police station without knowing where she was or what was happening, how would that affect her? He needed to make sure she was safe, not just physically, but emotionally. For now, she could rest. He would stay with her, make sure she was okay, and in the morning, they would figure everything else out. He returned to the recovery room and sat in the chair beside her bed. He could call the police in the morning. He just needed a few hours. Then he turned on the television to keep himself awake. And that's when he saw it. The breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. A woman's tearful face appeared on the screen, framed by a backdrop of flashing police lights. "Please," the woman begged, her voice thick with desperation. "If anyone has seen my daughter, please, I just want her back." Then came the next part. The screen changed to a still image of a little girl in a pink jacket. The same jacket Emily had been wearing when he found her. And then, beneath it, the news anchor's voice rang clear. "Authorities are searching for an unidentified suspect believed to have taken the missing child. Witnesses report a black male was last seen in the vicinity where she disappeared. Anyone with information is urged to come forward immediately." James's blood ran cold. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The city, once his sanctuary, had just turned into a trap. James sat frozen in place, his heart pounding against his ribs as the news broadcast continued. The reporter's voice carried an urgency that sent a chill down his spine. The words "black male suspect" echoed in his mind like a gavel striking down a verdict before the trial had even begun. This was exactly what he had feared. He had spent his life walking the tightrope of perception, aware that the slightest misstep could be enough to turn people's assumptions against him. And now, without a shred of evidence, without anyone bothering to ask questions, he had already been labeled a criminal. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, but his body remained tense. He needed to think. He needed to act. Emily lay still in the hospital bed beside him, her face peaceful in the soft glow of the overhead light. She had no idea what was happening. No idea that the man who had saved her might be moments away from losing everything. His first instinct was to call someone, his supervisor, a lawyer, anyone who could vouch for him. But who? The clinic had already made it clear that he was an outsider, a diversity hire they tolerated but didn't fully trust. Even if some of his colleagues respected him, would they risk their own reputations to stand up for him? The police would be here soon. That much was inevitable. He couldn't run. That would only confirm their suspicions. He couldn't hide. He wasn't guilty, and acting like he was would only make things worse. So he did the only thing he could do. He waited. The knock on the clinic door was sharp and deliberate, the kind that announced authority before a word was spoken. James rose from his chair, bracing himself. He opened the door to find two uniformed officers standing in the dimly lit hallway. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes. The other, younger, had a rigid posture, his hand resting near his holster. "Dr. James Carter?" the older officer asked. James nodded. "Yes. You need to come with us." His jaw tightened. "May I ask what this is about?" "You already know," the younger officer said, eyes scanning the room behind James. When he spotted Emily, his gaze hardened. "Step outside, now." James raised his hand slightly, keeping his movements deliberate. He had seen too many stories, had heard too many names turned into hashtags to take any chances. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "But before I go anywhere, I need you to understand that I'm the one who found her injured. I brought her here to treat her because I'm a surgeon. That's the only reason I—" The older officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around." James's stomach twisted, but he didn't fight. As the cold metal clicked shut around his wrists, he heard movement behind him. Emily had woken up. "Dr. James?" Her voice was small, confused. "What's happening?" James turned his head as much as he could. The sight of her sitting up in bed, looking at him with wide, worried eyes, made his chest tighten. The younger officer stepped forward. "Stay where you are, sweetheart. We're taking care of things." Emily frowned. "But he helped me. The officer placed a hand on her shoulder. "Your mom is looking for you. We'll take you to her." James clenched his teeth. Emily's expression wavered between relief and distress. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't understand why the man who had saved her was now the one in handcuffs. "James?" she whispered. He forced a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay, Emily." But it wasn't okay. The officers led him out of the clinic, their grip firm but not rough. Outside, a police car waited at the curb, its lights flashing against the dark glass of the building. The air was cold, but James barely felt it. As they walked him toward the vehicle, he caught sight of a group of bystanders watching from a distance. A few murmured among themselves. Some took out their phones. He could already imagine the headlines. "Black doctor arrested in connection with missing white child. Man suspected of kidnapping after taking child to private clinic." It didn't matter that he had done nothing wrong. It didn't matter that he had saved her. The world had already made up its mind. The station was sterile and impersonal, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. James sat in a metal chair, his wrists now free but still aching from the cuffs. Across from him sat Detective Harris, a man with sharp features and an expression of calculated neutrality. "So, Dr. Carter," Harris said, flipping through a folder, "want to tell me your side of the story?" James folded his hands on the table, keeping his posture straight. "I already did." Harris nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the table. "You're saying you found the girl, Emily, in an alley, injured, and instead of calling 911, you decided to take her to a private clinic." "Yes," James said evenly, "because I'm a surgeon, and I knew that waiting for an ambulance might worsen her condition. She had a severe fracture. If it wasn't set properly, she could have permanent damage." Harris tilted his head. "That's noble of you. But let's be honest, Doctor. If this had been a white man in your position, you think people would have reacted the same way?" The question was loaded, designed to provoke, to test him. James held his gaze. "No," he said finally. "I don't." Harris smirked, but there was no humor in it. "So, you knew how this would look? And you still went through with it?" "I did what was right," James said. "I wasn't going to let her suffer because of how it might look." The detective leaned back in his chair, studying him. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the door opened. A woman rushed in, Emily's mother. She was disheveled, her eyes red from crying, but when she saw James, she hesitated. "He saved my daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She told me everything. He's not the one you should be questioning." Detective Harris didn't react at first. He simply exhaled through his nose and closed the folder in front of him. "Well," he said, "that changes things." But James knew better than to feel relieved just yet. Hours later, he was released with no charges, no apologies, just a muttered, "You're free to go." But when he returned to the clinic, the real blow came. His supervisor, Dr. Whitman, was waiting for him outside his office, arms crossed. "You're being put on administrative leave," Whitman said, voice clipped, effective immediately. James felt the words land like a punch to the gut. For what? "Dr. Carter, you understand the situation. The media attention, the controversy, it's bad for the clinic. We can't afford the liability." James clenched his fists. "I did my job." Whitman sighed. "I'm sorry, but it's out of my hands." James looked around at the place he had sacrificed years of his life for, the place where he had worked twice as hard to prove himself, where he had saved lives, where he had believed, foolishly, that merit alone would be enough. He had done everything right. And it still wasn't enough. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away. The city, once a place of endless possibilities, now felt like a cage. James stepped out of the clinic, his breath curling in the cold night air. The building, with its sleek glass panels and pristine white walls, had once represented everything he had worked for. Now it was just another reminder of a system that had never truly accepted him. His suspension was unofficially a termination. He knew that much. There would be no press conference, no outright firing. Instead, he would be quietly pushed out, his reputation tarnished, his future uncertain. The weight of it settled in his chest, heavier than exhaustion, heavier than fear. As he walked toward his apartment, his mind raced. What was his next move? He had no job, no income, and now no credibility in a field where reputation was everything. He had spent his entire life proving himself, and in a single night they had taken it all away. But, as much as his own future seemed precarious, his thoughts kept circling back to Emily. He had saved her, but what kind of world had he returned her to? What if the next person who found a lost child hesitated? What if they let fear or prejudice stop them from doing the right thing? The thought gnawed at him. He wouldn't let this be the end. The next morning, James was startled awake by the ringing of his phone. He hadn't expected anyone to call. Most of his contacts from the clinic were either distancing themselves from him or pretending he no longer existed. He checked the screen. It was an unknown number. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but something in his gut told him to pick up. "Dr. Carter?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, familiar. "Yes. This is Olivia Dawson, Emily's mother." James sat up. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. Their last interaction had been brief. She had spoken to the detective, confirmed his innocence, and that had been it. But now she sounded urgent. "I just found out what happened at your clinic," she said. "They suspended you?" James let out a breath. "That's one way of putting it." "That's unacceptable." Her voice grew sharper. "You saved my daughter, and now they're punishing you for it?" "It's not the first time something like this has happened," James admitted. "I knew the risks when I brought her in. The moment the media got involved, I became a liability." There was a pause. Then Olivia said, "Meet me at my office in an hour. We need to talk." James frowned. "Your office?" "I'm an attorney, Dr. Carter, and I'm not letting this go." Olivia's office was in a towering high-rise downtown. When James arrived, he was met by a receptionist who led him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Olivia was already there, pacing, her phone buzzing with non-stop notifications. James barely had time to sit before she turned to him, eyes blazing with determination. "This is already gaining traction," she said, gesturing to her phone. "People are asking questions. The media is running with two versions of the story, one where you're a hero and one where you're a controversial figure." James let out a dry laugh. "Controversial for saving a child?" "For being a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time," she corrected. "We both know how this works. They won't outright accuse you of wrongdoing, but they'll let the public draw their own conclusions." James clenched his jaw. "What's your plan?" "I want to go public with the truth," Olivia said. "An official statement, a press conference. I want people to know exactly what happened, that you did your job, that you acted when no one else would, and that you were punished for it." James hesitated. "And you think that will change anything?" "It will, if we put enough pressure on the clinic," Olivia said. "They want to quietly sweep this under the rug. But if we control the narrative first, they won't be able to." James considered her words. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight. He had spent his entire career trying to blend in, to prove himself through his work rather than through confrontation. But now, he saw that playing by the rules had only gotten him so far. They were counting on him to walk away quietly. Maybe it was time to do the opposite. The press conference was held in front of Olivia's law firm, with cameras from every major news outlet lined up along the sidewalk. Reporters murmured among themselves as James stepped up to the podium, flanked by Olivia and community activists who had rallied behind his case. He took a deep breath, scanning the sea of faces before him. He had spent years in operating rooms, making split-second decisions with lives on the line. But standing here, knowing that every word he said could change the course of his future, felt like an entirely different kind of pressure. Still, he spoke. "I'm Dr. James Carter. A week ago, I found a lost and injured child. I did what any doctor would do. I helped her. I provided medical care when she needed it most." He paused, letting his words settle. The cameras flashed. "For that, I was arrested, labeled a suspect before I was ever asked a single question. And when the truth came out, my career was still taken from me. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I was seen as a risk." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Olivia stepped forward. "Dr. Carter's story is not unique. How many others hesitate to do the right thing because they know they will be judged not by their actions, but by the assumptions people make about them?" James met the gaze of the reporters. "I don't want sympathy. I don't want apologies. I want change. I want to live in a world where people like me aren't punished for being in the right place at the wrong time." The crowd erupted in questions. Reporters shouted for responses, but James simply stepped back. The statement had been made. Now, the real battle would begin. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags calling for justice trended nationwide. Prominent figures in medicine and civil rights spoke out. And then the clinic responded. A carefully worded statement was released. "We recognize the concerns raised by recent events involving Dr. Carter. The clinic remains committed to fairness and inclusivity. We are currently reviewing our policies and procedures to ensure that all staff members are treated with the respect and integrity they deserve." No mention of reinstating him. No direct admission of wrongdoing. But James knew what it meant. They were feeling the pressure. The following week, Olivia received a call from the clinic's board. They wanted to meet. James sat across from the clinic's senior executives, watching as they squirmed under the weight of public scrutiny. Dr. Whitman, the man who had fired him without a second thought, looked particularly uncomfortable. "We may have been too hasty," Whitman admitted, folding his hands on the table. "We would like to offer you your position back." James studied them. "And if this hadn't gone public?" No one answered. He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not coming back." Whitman blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm starting my own practice," James said, "one that actually stands by the principles you pretend to." Olivia smiled beside him. Whitman opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew there was no winning this. James stood, buttoning his jacket. "I'll send my resignation in writing." And with that, he walked away. He had lost one battle, but he was about to win the war. James stepped out of the clinic's boardroom for the last time, inhaling deeply as the cold air hit his face. The city stretched before him, a place that had once felt full of possibility, but had quickly shown its sharp edges when he needed it most. He had spent his entire career believing that if he worked hard enough, stayed disciplined, and avoided controversy, his skills would be enough. Now, he knew better. Walking away from the clinic wasn't just about leaving a toxic work environment. It was about reclaiming control over his own future. They had tried to strip him of everything, but he wasn't going to let them define his story. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Olivia. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as soon as he answered. "I can still push them for a settlement, some kind of restitution. You don't have to start over with nothing." James glanced up at the towering glass building behind him. "I'm not starting over," he said. "I'm building something better." For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight in his chest start to lift. The next few months were a blur of work. Starting his own practice wasn't easy. He had to navigate mountains of paperwork, secure funding, and find a location. But through it all, Olivia was there, helping him cut through legal barriers, connecting him with investors, and making sure that the media frenzy around his case worked in his favor rather than against him. Word spread quickly. Community leaders, doctors who had followed his case, and patients who had been turned away from elite institutions all started reaching out. They saw what he was trying to do: build a clinic that put people first, a place where the best medical care wasn't reserved for those who could afford it or for those who fit the profile of the ideal patient. His vision was clear: a practice where medicine was about healing, not bureaucracy. The hardest part was finding a location. Most commercial real estate owners hesitated at the idea of a black doctor with a controversial history setting up a clinic in their buildings. Some outright refused to rent to him. Others jacked up prices, assuming he wouldn't be able to afford it. But Olivia wasn't just a lawyer. She was a force of nature. She found a space in a historically underserved neighborhood, a place that desperately needed health care but had long been neglected. It wasn't in a fancy high-rise. It didn't have the state-of-the-art luxury of his previous workplace, but it had something better: potential. When James walked through the empty space for the first time, he could already see it. A waiting room filled with people who had never felt welcome in hospitals before. A place where no one would hesitate before calling for help, afraid of how it might look. A space where children like Emily wouldn't have to rely on luck to get the care they needed. It wasn't going to be easy. But then, nothing in his life ever had been. The opening of the Carter Medical Center was met with both excitement and skepticism. Some news outlets painted him as a trailblazer, a man who had taken injustice and turned it into something revolutionary. Others saw him as reckless, a controversial figure setting up a practice outside of the established system. He didn't care. On the day of the grand opening, James stood at the front doors, looking out at the line of patients already forming. Families, elderly neighbors, young parents with their children. People who had been ignored, dismissed, or treated as statistics by larger institutions. And then, through the crowd, he saw her. Emily. She was standing beside Olivia, her small hand tucked into her mother's. She no longer wore the hesitant expression of a child unsure of the world around her. She looked up at him and smiled. James felt his throat tighten. It had all started with her. When she reached him, she tilted her head up. "You did it," she said, beaming. He knelt so they were at eye level. "I did," he said, "because of you." She hugged him, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel everything. The exhaustion, the anger, the uncertainty, but also the pride, the hope, the knowledge that this was only the beginning. When he stood, Olivia smirked. "I think she just declared herself your first official patient." James chuckled. "She was always my first patient." He turned back toward the clinic, took one last breath, and stepped inside. A new chapter had begun. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more, check out our other videos. There's plenty more to discover.